So, Bonda Cunningham, it is so good to see you.
Good to see you, Kevin.
Thank you so much for inviting me into your home here in Brooklyn. And we went over some of the archival stuff that your husband, Bob Cunningham, the wonderful bassist, has collected, some of which are going to be donated to Rutgers University.
Yes.
Talk about collecting some of that archival material, and what decision brought you to decide to make that donation?
Well, Bob has always had an office as long as we've been married. And his office has always been floor to ceiling, wall to wall, shelves, files, stuff, right? And while he was still alive, I used to threaten him by saying, I really need you to kind of organize all that stuff you got in there. I said, because if you go first, I'm calling it a dumpster and I'm just going to put it out the window. And he'd say, you can't do that. You can't do that. There's important stuff in there. There's valuable stuff in there. I said, well, would you please try to organize it, right? So as it turned out, he went first. And of course, I couldn't do what I threatened to do. So really, actually, during the pandemic, when I was getting ready for a renovation of my house, I really needed that room. And so I just spent really months in there going through every shelf, every file,
Wow.
every box, everything. And there was a lot of stuff there. And I could tell a lot of it was really, it was interesting. It was just amazing, a lot of it.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I can't throw this stuff away. I've got to find some place for it to go. I didn't feel like I could keep it or should keep it.
Yeah.
But that it needed to be preserved. And there are a lot of things I didn't keep. Maybe had I seen the archivist at Rutgers during that time, because I did reach out to them early on, but it was a pandemic and nobody could come. And I really kind of had to do something. So there's some things I didn't keep.
Yeah.
But I kept a lot of stuff. And just tried to break it down roughly between, general jazz, things that are very specific to Bob, things that were about the things other than music that he was involved in, because he was involved in a lot of things.
Yeah.
And photos and audio-visual materials, just a wealth of material, really.
I was with the wife of a really fine drummer, and we were at an event, and one of the guests had come over and introduced himself, and she asked, and he asked her what she did, and she explained that she worked in the healthcare industry, and that her husband was a drummer.
Right.
And so he said, well, will he be someone I know? And when she mentioned his name, he says, no, I don't know that person. And so she says, well, he's probably not a famous drummer. And she quickly said, no, but he worked every day. He worked every day.
Yes.
And he went through like 4 passports a year. And he sent all his kids to college, and she really didn't have to work. And to me, that sort of, it really exemplifies a successful working musician.
Yes.
Who is always in demand. And you may not know that person by name, but the industry knows that person. And people all around the country know that person, especially if they're based in a certain city. Like if you're based in New York, if you're based in Chicago, musicians come to those cities all the time, and they need other musicians to play with.
Right.
And in a lot of instances, it's people like Bob Cunningham that could possibly get that first call with a vocalist who comes to New York, or other musicians, or maybe the bass player bass got broken or left on a flight somewhere.
Yeah.
And then that's the person that you call. And talk a little bit about being the wife of a working musician.
Well, it was really interesting. I've always had very traditional jobs, very traditional work, and it was really eye-opening. You know, for me, you have interviews, you send your resume, you get hired for something, and you kind of know where you're going every day for weeks and months and years even. And to see someone who basically was every week, every day almost, getting a new job.
Right.
Day after day after day. It was eye-opening. I'm really in awe of what working musicians do. Every year in August, Month at a Glance issues their new calendars for the following year.
Yeah.
And so Bob will always be the first one at Staples to get the calendar for the next year. And when you think about it, you get this book and you open it up and there's like 12 times 30 roughly little blank white spaces.
Yeah.
That you have to fill in with gigs. And you may be lucky and you may get a regular gig someplace where you can just fill in a whole string of Mondays or Thursdays or whatever. But that's kind of rare. By the time I met Bob, that was becoming a rarity.
Mm-hmm.
So that at that point, you are looking to fill your calendar day by day, week by week. You're trying to get as much filled in as possible, such that by the time the year ends, you've got a calendar where there's something written in every box that you want something to be written in.
Right.
But that's hard work. And it was, as I said, it was eye-opening to see what's involved, because I've always loved music. I've always had music in my life, and I've enjoyed going out and hearing people. And I knew about people who played music and all the practicing that they do to keep their skills up. But you don't think about what it takes to be working all the time.
Right.
And that's another whole kind of thing.
Yeah.
And Bob was particularly, I would say, good at that. He was a very kind of disciplined person. I'm a Capricorn, and so was he, and we kind of thought alike in terms of like order of things and that kind of thing. And even like he was really creative, he still had a certain kind of discipline about how he went about generating work. And some work came to him. Obviously, he's worked with some very notable bands in the past,
yes.
And some work came to him. He didn't have to go seek it, but he still had other little white boxes that he needed to get filled in. And he was pretty methodical about getting out to hear other people. Pretty much every week, he would pick a night. If he wasn't working, he'd go out and he'd hit 2 or 3 places. He'd listen to other people, see his friends, and he'd see people he might want to hire, and people would see him who might want to hire him.
Yeah.
And that was a regular thing with him. He also always promoted his gigs. So Bob had a printer that he worked with all the time before most of us had printers in our houses. And Bob was the flyer man.
Yeah. Long before social media.
Yeah, I mean, he made flyers for his gigs, and he got them out there. He distributed them, he got them posted in windows or whatever. And he did that kind of thing all the time. He didn't rely on somebody else to promote his work. And so, again, that was a real education for me, and what it takes because not, after you get the gig, you want people to come.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
one of his biggest pet peeves was people who have venues who think that all they have to do is get a venue and open the door and maybe hire a band, and they don't think anything about promotion.
Right. Right.
They think if they open the doors, it's up to the musicians to promote their gigs. They don't think they have to promote their venue. And Bob used to go and visit some of the venues he was working at, especially if the owner was somebody he really wanted to see succeed.
Right. Right.
And he would go and sit with them and say, these are the kinds of things you should be doing, whether I'm here or not. Whoever you have playing here, you want people to come. And he'd tell them about Jazzline, and he'd tell them about the BGO calendar, and he'd tell them about, little ads in the Village Voice and flyers and doing all these kinds of things to generate business. And it was amazing how many of them knew it all.
Yeah.
And didn't want to hear it. And, it's kind of a shame because I still hear musicians now, his colleagues, his friends, our friends talk about how a lot of places that present musicians really don't do the whole thing to make the musician and their place successful.
Exactly.
Exactly. So it's been an education to see how it's done.
Yeah. And talk about how you were able to navigate your own successful career and be a musician's wife and get involved in, like you said, the bread and butter of being a musician, like going out and promoting the events and letting people know that you're available for events as well. Yeah. Talk about how you navigated those two things, because you were a professional woman in your own right.
Right. So, there was a time when I first met Bob, it was kind of funny, really, because, of course, when you just meet somebody and you like them and they like you, and you kind of want to go to all the gigs, you want you to come to work with them all the time. And after a certain amount of time, I'm going out to work with him and I'm getting back at like 1 o'clock in the morning and I got to get up at 6 and get ready to go to work, And at one point I said, you know what, I can't live your life and mine too. We have to kind of finesse it a little bit. But, it's in some ways it's not easy because our schedules were so different.
Yeah.
He's a night person, very much. I'm a morning person. And I've always had to get up early. And then we had our daughter just really like about a year and a half after we got married. And we were like senior parents. Okay. I was 45. He was 55. And so, it wasn't easy, shall we say. But so, we had a little person to get up and squared away before I went to work. And then, he might be sleeping until midday, and then he'd get up and rehearse and practice or whatever, or be on the phone or what have you. And it was a real balancing act. And he used to do this thing like a foghorn sometimes in the evenings, because sometimes I'd be coming in and he'd be on his way out to a gig. And that happened a lot. It was a matter of, just having a partnership and deciding, okay, we're going to make this work. And when I could go to work with him, I did. Yeah. And then there were times when I really couldn't. And he understood that because, again, we had a young child. And then at one point we took care of his mother for almost 10 years, and she really couldn't be left alone. So there were lots of times when I couldn't go to work with him. So, I had my life, so there were times when we'd go to something that was related to my work, and, he'd be introduced as my husband, and there were times I'd go to work with him, and I'd be introduced as his wife, so we had different identities depending on what venue we were in, but we made it work.
Now, you grew up in the wonderful city of Baltimore.
Yes.
What was life like growing up in a city like Baltimore during the time you were coming up?
Well, okay, I was born in 45, just before Roosevelt died, just before the war ended. And Baltimore was very much a segregated city. And black people lived in pretty much at that time one zip code in West Baltimore and another zip code in East Baltimore.
That's right. And
I lived in West Baltimore at the time. And so I went to segregated schools until junior high school. My mother was a teacher. She was a kindergarten teacher, and a lot of her friends were teachers. And we had a nice life. We had our own world. The school systems were totally separate.
Yeah.
So what was good about that is that our teachers, the vice principal, the school superintendent, they all looked like us. And that was really a good thing because they cared about us. And so we had our own social circles, our own social world. There were a lot of black businesses in Baltimore.
Yeah.
There were black movie theaters, and we kind of didn't think twice about going to the theaters that were basically ours. And we just went to them, and we didn't think about the fact that there were other theaters that we couldn't go to. I do remember that there were stores where we couldn't try clothes on.
Yeah.
The major department stores in Baltimore. And so my mother, I think that my mother, and I think all of our parents did, they tried to sort of guide us through that world so that we didn't get hurt by it.
Exactly.
We kind of stayed in our lane, and we didn't really venture out, although Baltimore has a long history of civil rights activism also. And I didn't find out until I was maybe almost grown that my mother had been active with a civil rights group, I guess before she married or before she had me, at any rate.
Right.
But the Clarence Mitchell family is Baltimore.
Yes,
Billy
absolutely.
Jackson, Mrs. Mitchell's mother, was NAACP, a real pioneer. So there was a lot of stuff that went on there.
I know. I got to know Lisa Mitchell real well. She had a radio program in Baltimore. So like you say, the Mitchell family was very, very prominent there. And like you said, there was a lot of activism going on in the city of Baltimore. But what was the music scene like for you growing up there?
Well, I didn't really hear much in the way of jazz until maybe I was in high school.
Yeah.
What we heard a lot of growing up was choral music. I took piano lessons.
Yeah. The church.
Church, of course.
Yeah.
And because at that time, on Sundays, nothing happened but church. Stores were closed. Everything was closed. So on Sundays, you went to church. You came home, you had your early dinner, and you did one of three things. You went for a ride, you went visiting, or you went to a concert in a church sanctuary. And though I have to say that there were times, mostly, you know, our parents dragged us to these concerts.
Yeah.
We heard the most amazing people that I didn't realize at the time how amazing they were. But, you know, we heard Robert McFerrin, Bobby McFerrin's father.
Yes, that's right.
We heard Madewilda Dobbs. We heard all of these black classical singers who didn't have other places to perform, and they did the church circuit.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so we would go to these Sunday afternoon concerts in churches, and we heard amazing people. So my mother played the piano because as a kindergarten teacher at that time, that was a requirement that you play the piano because you had to play music for the kids. And so we always had a piano in our house, always. And so my mother would sit down and play sometimes. We had a record player, and she had records, some pop music. And then some of the singers, you know, the Ella Fitzgerald and people of that era. And then actually when I was in high school is when an organization called the Left Bank Jazz Society was formed in Baltimore. And it was a group of men who got together to form this thing and to present jazz at a club in Baltimore. And at that time, we were too young. Clubs were 21 and up.
Right.
We were not yet 21. But somehow, I don't even know right now how it came to be that we got to go. But we did. I had a friend who used to write an article for the Afro-American about Left Bank Jazz Society performances. And we would go sometimes to hear music. And that was the first time I started really hearing jazz myself.
Right.
And then when I went to college, then several people, including somebody that I was dating at the time, he and his friends were really big jazz fans.
Yeah. Now, where did you go to school?
I went to Hampton for 2 years, and then I transferred to Morgan. I graduated from Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where.
What was the thing that you were most surprised about when you first became a musician's wife? What was what surprised you about the life that your husband lived initially when you guys first got together?
I think how hard he worked to work.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we go out and hear music, we see the performance and we think, okay, somebody called this person, this band, and invited them to come and play, and they did that, and they do it over and over and over again. And I don't think we realize the work that goes behind appearing on a regular basis. Bob used to say, you're either appearing or you're disappearing. And so I think most musicians know that they have to work at appearing. And unless you kind of maybe join a band that has a very prominent leader that's working all the time, and you just stay with that band for years and years and years, you are always in the position of needing to generate your work.
Absolutely.
And I mean, this was Bob's career from the time he was a teenager. He and his cousin Bobby, they had a band when they were like, 15 or 16 years old. They were too young to go to the club, but they had gigs at the club. This is in Cleveland, where he's from. And they had their own band. They had little ads in the paper and everything. And Bob married for the first time very young. He and his wife were teenagers when they got married. They had their daughter, and then their second daughter, again, fairly young. They were like late teens, early 20s.
Yeah.
And he had other jobs initially when he was married, but he was already a musician at that point. And then he decided that he was coming to New York because being in Cleveland, a lot of other musicians came through there all the time to play in Cleveland. He met a lot of them. A lot of them said, you really should come to New York. And at some point he decided, okay, he was going to do it. And he loves to tell the story about how in October of 1960, he got in his car with his bass and he drove nonstop to New York, went straight to Mittens, and got a chance to hear some of the people that he, really admired greatly. To meet people right away. One of the people who had encouraged him to come helped him find a place to live on Clawson Avenue here in Brooklyn. He never forgot that.
Yeah.
And he made several friends who connected him to other work. And he met Milt Hinton. And Milt really liked what Bob was doing. And Milt introduced him to Dizzy. and Dizzy invited him to join his band. And Bob had his very first airplane flight going with Dizzy to Sao Paulo. And he was with that band for several years, about 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And so, I kind of forgot my chain of thought here.
No, you were walking through Bob Cunningham's career, and I like the idea of he being with Dizzy Gillespie over a longer period of time, and it was a great way for me to segue into a question that I want you to talk about the length of being with a band, how that brings stability in the home as opposed to working every night with different groups. Talk about the differences of being, a bandmate with a band over a longer period of time. Like 3 years is a good period of time to be with one group.
Right.
Talk about how that stability makes a difference in your relationship, in your home, as opposed to going out and playing with different groups day in and day out.
Yeah, well, in fact, I mean, the times that he was with, say, major leaders actually preceded our marriage, because he was also with Yusef Lateef for about 7 or 8 years.
Right.
And so that was during the years of his first marriage. They had 3 children altogether. And in many ways, I think it was great because Dizzy and Yusef really, commanded good pay.
Absolutely.
At that time,
Absolutely.
They traveled extensively, and he was able to provide very well for his family. By the time I met him, he was pretty much working as a leader himself,
right,
as well as working as a sideman with other people. And so I think it was different for him than the past. The only other person that he worked with for a fair number of years after we met was Illinois Jacquette.
Yes.
But Illinois had a big band, and big bands don't work as often as smaller groups.
Right. Especially in a period where big bands weren't in favor, where more of the smaller quintets, quartets were popular at that particular juncture of the genre.
Right. Yeah. I mean, fielding a large band is a major undertaking. It's huge. And, your payroll has got to be really big.
Yes.
And the logistics are really complicated. And so there really wasn't much of that. But he did work with Illinois for several years after we got married. And again, that was a nice period, but it wasn't constant.
Yeah.
He was still working a lot as a sideman or as a leader on his own during that time period, and during most of the time that we were married. We were married 28 years.
Yeah.
We were together like 34 years. So I would say most of the time he was really, hustling.
Yeah.
Really, hustling. I mean, he got incoming. He got calls where people called him, but he didn't kind of depend on that.
Right.
He was always looking to fill that calendar. And so there would be days when he worked doubles, because one of the things that happens when you work freelance like that is if a gig comes through and you can logistically do it, you do it.
Right.
Because there may be days when there isn't anything.
Exactly.
And so one of Bob's real core principles was to do things that kind of leveled out your income. So he has, since he and Evelyn, his first wife, were married and lived here in their 60s, they owned a home. He always had a home that had at least one rental unit in it.
Yes, yes.
That was a core principle for him. You always, to buy real estate and have rental income. And he preached that to all of his colleagues all the time. because it meant having a cushion, having something that smooths out the ups and downs in your calendar. And that's something that he really believed in and really, adhered to.
Yeah.
So that was a core principle for us, too. I mean, I was, at the time that we both met, we were both landlords. We both owned property.
Right.
And
right.
so we understood each other in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
And we knew how to do stuff around the house. He was very handy. He could build things. And lots of times late at night, he'd go down in the basement and he'd build something. He built the hutch over his desk and he would fix things. His mother was widowed when he was only 9 months old, and his mother never remarried. So she taught him to do everything. She knew how to do handy stuff around the house, fix things, and she taught him to do all that stuff, how to cook, how to do laundry, how to clean, how to sew. So from the time he was really young, he kind of had a little bit of a hustle about him, so that he had a booming shoe shine business in Cleveland when he was a little guy. He was like 8, 9, 10 years old.
That's something that we have in common.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, he was very proud of the fact that he had a really good business doing shoes.
Yes.
When he was really very young.
Yeah, I know that world very well from the early 60s.
Yeah. So,
Amazing.
I have to say that not just about Bob, but about, all of his colleagues that I've met, a lot of whom, are my friends too, became my friends too and still are, that I have so much respect for their capacity to not only be really talented performers, but to be able to make a living. Oh, that was the point I got away from, was that after he left Cleveland and came to New York, then he'd had some other jobs. He even worked on a slaughterhouse at one time in Cleveland. He only worked as a musician. He never did anything else.
Yeah.
He was 100%. That was his career. That was how he made his living. That's how he raised his family. And it takes a lot more than I think people realize to be able to do that. I think he and a number of his colleagues are fortunate in the sense that maybe they married people like me who had regular jobs.
Yeah.
And so I had health insurance, so we had health insurance. And it helped to have the second income because we could build a base, we could own our home, we could have cars, although we never had fancy cars. We always bought used cars and tried to pay cash for them. But I think that combination actually works kind of well. And I think you find that there are a fair number of musicians who have wives who have fairly traditional jobs.
Absolutely. Like I'm very, very close with Carl Grubb's wife, Barbara Grubbs. And she speaks the same gospel as you do in terms of being a musician's wife and having a career in her own right. But I have two final questions for you.
Okay.
What would you like the jazz community to know about Bob Cunningham? And secondly, what do you think his legacy in jazz will be?
Wow. Well, I guess I'd like them to know how broad his interests were, how interested he was in things other than music. One of the things I learned in going through all of the materials he collected over the years and the things he was involved in is that he was involved in a lot of different things. They were allied in the sense that they were the arts.
That's right.
But they were different kinds of arts. He was very involved in theater, in black theater. He was very involved with poets. He worked extensively with dancers of all kinds. He he was close to a lot of visual artists, painters and sculptors. And I think that being interested and being involved in all these different things really kind of informed who he was. And he was very involved in the movement for black people to be recognized and to have our rights secured. And so he was an activist in many ways. He was involved in a lot of kind of grassroots black liberation work. And so I guess for people who don't know that side of him, I guess I would like them to know that, he did other stuff besides play the bass. He did a lot of things besides that. And I think that in terms of his legacy, I mean, he has his music, but since he passed, a lot of people have spoken to me about their relationship with him. And so I think his legacy has a lot to do with his influence on his colleagues.
Absolutely.
A lot. He was generous with advice. wasn't always welcome, but I'm sure lots of times it was. But a lot of people heard him and took his advice, and it was to their benefit. And so I think that's a pretty good legacy when people kind of take your example or the kinds of things you suggest to them and build on it and make it work for you. That's a great thing to do. It's like being a teacher.
Absolutely.
The same kind of thing, that kind of impact on people going forward. So
yeah,
I would say that.
Yeah. I just have to say thank you so very much for allowing me to go through some of the archival material that you're going to leave here in Brooklyn. I know the lion's share is going to be donated to Rutgers University, the Institute of Jazz Studies.
Yes.
But the stuff that you're going to leave here in Brooklyn, and it was a pleasure to go through some of that stuff. It's fascinating.
It is. Yeah.
Pieces that you still have, and again, I want to say thank you so very much for your time. It's a pleasure being here this afternoon in your home.
Well, it's great to have you here, Kevin. It was really good talking to you and visiting with you.
And it's been an absolute pleasure, and I want to say thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you.